Okay, it's 5:35 and we're going to get started tonight. I'm Alana McGrattan, president of the New Mexico chapter of the National New Deal Preservation Association, and this is our first fireside chat. We've had many of them in person, but now in the new environment we're going to be doing them virtually. And I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. We're very honored to have Christian Waguespack, who is the 20th century Curator of Art at the New Mexico Museum of Art. And he is going to do a presentation on Eugenie Shonnard, who is one of our New Deal artists. And we have more information at the end about a particular project that we have relating to Eugenie. So I'd like to introduce Christian.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I want to start by saying thank you, Catherine, for your introduction. And thank you all, Catherine, Kathy, and Brett, for working with me on this and inviting me to come. It's a real honor to be here and to share a little bit about Eugenie Shonnard with everyone. So let me share my screen. Got ahead of ourselves. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, then I will dive right in. Tonight, I'm going to tell you all about the life and career of Eugenie Shonnard, who is a prominent Santa Fe sculptor, but had an internationally renowned career that took her from New York to Paris to Prague, and of course, back to the Southwest. And at the end of this program, Kathy and Catherine will tell you about this fantastic fountain that she designed and built down in TRC. But before we get there, I want to walk you through her life and career and give you a bit of a background about who she was, where she came from, and her significance as an artist. I would imagine that many of you, like myself, may not be very familiar with Eugenie Shonnard. Before I came to New Mexico, I didn't know very much about Eugenie Shonnard, who I have pictured here. This is a snapshot that we have in the archives of the New Mexico Museum of Art. And it shows the artist working on one of the Pueblo busts that she became very well known for during the Santa Fe portion of her career. So later on, and this is in clay. And the way that I got to know Eugenie Shonnard, or was first introduced to Shonnard, was through an exhibition that I curated back in 2019 at the New Mexico Museum of Art called Carved and Cast 20th Century New Mexican Sculpture. And in this exhibition, I did a broad survey of sculptural work in the state over the 20th century, but had particular alcoves dedicated to particularly interesting figures in our history that I thought we would all benefit from learning a little bit more in depth about. And one of them was Shonnard. And I'm showing you here just one view, one installation view of that exhibition that shows you a small survey of the kind of work she was known for doing across a variety of media. We have the mahogany busts that she started doing when she was here in New Mexico of indigenous subject matter. That smaller little black bust is one of the stone pieces she was doing in Brittany that I'll tell you a little bit about. And then on the left side, we have a marble sculpture of the Virgin Mary that was from earlier in her career. And then this beautiful mahogany seated sculpture of a native chief that I'll go in detail a little bit about, but it gained a lot of traction for her in Europe. It was very popular in Paris, and we're very lucky to have it here still in New Mexico. So the significance for Shonnard for the New Mexico Museum of Art is in her legacy, her donation. She gifted her archives. She gifted the remaining work that she had left that wasn't sold or part of another program to the New Mexico Museum Foundation. But she also donated her house and her property, and that's what I'm showing you here. If any of you drive through Paseo del Peralta regularly, you would be familiar with this house. And about 3 years ago, it was decided that this house would be the new offices for the New Mexico Museum Foundation. Now, this became important not only to show the continued significance of her generosity for the state, that we were able to get these beautiful new offices for our foundation, but because of what new information it brought in terms of research and practice for her as an artist. Now, as a historic house here in Santa Fe, for the renovations to modernize the building so it could be up to date for offices to occur, an archaeological survey had to happen. So the entire property had a proper and thorough archaeological evaluation. And through that evaluation, we found a lot of materials, a lot of her artistic materials, her sculptural materials, and found evidence of some experimentations that she did in terms of wanting to work with and create her own new media. So just in the past 3 years, we've gained a lot of fresh and valuable information about her late work as an artist. And I'll tell you a little bit more in detail about some of those findings later on when we get to that period in her work. But I want to take us back a little bit to look at her work as a whole. So part of the reason we're here tonight is to celebrate and hopefully raise enough funds to restore to its former and very formidable glory a fountain that's located down in TRC. And if you look at your top left of the screen, what I'm showing you is just a detail of this beautiful fountain. It's the top piece, and it's kind of, for those of you maybe who haven't seen it, what it was whenever it was designed was this beautiful deco sculpture that was a fountain that is done in several tiers. So we've got the tower in the middle that has 4 frogs facing out with the water coming out of their mouths. That then goes down to 4 beautiful duck figures. And then what you're not seeing here, but you will see later, are these gorgeous turtles. And unfortunately, over the years, given the nature of the material that this fountain is made out of, given all sorts of reasons why something so valuable and precious might have fallen into disrepair, we've lost a lot of this. So hopefully, keeping this fountain in mind and looking at the rest of her work that I'm going to walk you through, you'll all get a sense of the real beauty and value of this piece and why restoring it to its former glory is really going to be something that's valuable, not only for art lovers in the state, but for really anybody who cares about beauty, art, and history. So one of the things you might have noticed about the fountain, and one of the first things that I really fell in love with Shonnard, was the use of animals, right? That the several tiers of this fountain all have to do with animals in some way: the frogs, the ducks, the turtles. And animals come up in her work again and again and again. And there's a very important reason for that that goes way back to her childhood. So Eugenie Shonnard was a very sickly child. From a very young age, she had a disease that I don't know if it was ever really properly diagnosed, because we're thinking, she was born in Yonkers in 1886. So medical science was a lot different than it was today. I don't know exactly where we were in terms of evaluating uncommon illnesses, but the way that she described it was that she simply just was unable to keep any food down, that she would eat and that it just wouldn't stay. And she was bedridden for most of her childhood. There was a certain point, where she was so kind of emaciated and sick that her parents walked into her room and thought that she had passed away. And the doctor came in, and at that point they had kind of, for lack of a better term, given up on treatments. And the doctor said, take all the medicine away, get all the medical equipment out, and bring in some little ducks into her bedroom. And that's what they did, according to her own oral tradition. This is coming from her own stories, of course, but I believe they're very true. And that it was that experience of them bringing the animals into her room that kind of gave her the push to want to move forward and get better, because of that experience of the joy that she felt with those animals. And she never lost this love of animals for the rest of her life. And we'll see how that's come up again in interesting ways in her later work. But you'll notice that they're a reoccurring theme, and that reoccurrence, that devotion to the subject of animals, comes from that significant moment in her childhood. We'll talk a little bit more about the development of other subjects later. Below the fountain, what I'm showing you is a low relief sculpture that's done in something called Keenstone. And Keenstone was a sculptural and architectural material that she invented herself. And I will tell you a little bit more about that in detail a little bit later. But I wanted to bring this in as another example of the way that her sculpture very often worked architecturally, particularly during the New Deal period. She was making low relief sculptures that were designed to be incorporated into other elements of architecture. So in that way, very much like the fountain, they became public pieces. This one on the bottom is one of the few that we do have in a museum collection, because as you could imagine, sculpture made to be part of architecture is difficult to get into a museum without losing the architecture, right? So many of that is either still in the site that it was designed for, or unfortunately lost to time, which is something that we want to make sure does not happen to this fountain. And then the pieces on the other side I'm showing you are some of her busts that she made, and she was very well known for these busts. It was kind of what she was most famous for here in Santa Fe because of the way that she worked with indigenous sitters. So here we see a portrait of a Pueblo person. And then here below, this is a portrait of a woman from Brittany in France, just to give you an idea of the way that maybe a little bit of her style changed when she went from Europe here to the Southwest. The top piece, which is a little bit later, looks a little bit more modern than the bottom piece that is a little bit more traditional. So this is just to give you kind of an overview of her work in a broad sense. Now a bit of background from her education. So in the 1910s, she enrolled in the New York School of Applied Design for Women. This was impressive for a number of reasons. One was that in the 1910s, it was very difficult for a woman to be able to get the art education you need to become a professional artist. There weren't as many opportunities for women as there were for men. A lot of that had to do with the way that some of these academies were set up, that a lot of the work that were done in these academies revolved around the nude model, which it was kind of considered to be inappropriate for a woman to see. So a lot of times it was difficult for them to get access to those resources that they needed. That's another reason some people think that maybe she focused so much on animals, and you see this with a lot of women artists from the past when they were not able to get access to the nude figure that really was kind of the cornerstone of building your career as a professional artist during the academic era. One of the subjects you could study were animal figures. So from characters like Rosa Bonheur down, a lot of the great women artists made their careers because they were given the access to animal subjects that they weren't given to human subjects for reasons of propriety. But one of the areas of art that was considered an appropriate kind of ground for women was design, decorative design. And the New York School of Applied Design was one of these unique schools that offered a platform for working class women to take classes and get the skills that they needed to make a living for themselves in the arts. But so that was good. What's so great about this is that the curriculum was very narrow, right? The idea that it was one thing, whereas on the other hand, as a woman, you were kind of relegated to working in decorative fields. And here you can see, these are kind of patterns for silks that folks at the school would have been taught to design. But Eugenie Shonnard took this and ran with it. So if we think about her background as an artist who kind of got their start in the world of design, we should not be surprised that she ended up working under one of the 19th and 20th century artists, most prominent artists in the world of design, and incorporating or blurring the line between design and lowbrow art and highbrow fine art, Alphonse Mucha. So after she studied in 1910 at the New York School for Applied Design, she made a very bold decision that she was going to go to Europe and she was going to study to become a proper artist and work with some of the greatest names that were working around the turn of the century, Alphonse Mucha being one of them. And we'll talk about some of her other teachers a little bit down the road. This was kind of a monumental thing for her, and nobody really thought she could do it because keep in mind, she was a very sickly child, and that didn't just disappear. She just learned to cope with some of the things that were holding her back. And when she announced to her family and to her friends that she was going to set sail across the Atlantic, land in Europe, and become not only a professional artist, but a professional sculptor, an art form that really does need an enormous amount of physical strength. There are reports from this time saying that she was probably about 90 pounds when she was doing this because she was still having health issues. Nobody thought she could do it. Finally, she wore her mother down, and her mother agreed to take the trip with her. And they got on a boat, they went to Europe, and she studied in France for a little bit, and she also studied in the Czech Republic with Alphonse Mucha. Now, one of the reasons that I think that she looked for Alphonse Mucha as somebody who would guide her is because of this background in applied design, working with things like wallpaper and jewelry and decorative fixtures was very much something that Alphonse Mucha valued as the leader of the Art Nouveau movement. And Art Nouveau, of course, was this fantastic turn-of-the-century movement that looked to bring nature into design and to create total works of art. So in addition to creating, large-scale oil paintings and sculptures, Mucha was also interested in designing chairs and wallpaper and fixtures. And one of his greatest works that I had the pleasure of seeing is a building called the Obetzny Doom. It's the municipal house in the Czech Republic. And it's noteworthy because he designed absolutely every aspect of the building, not only the large paintings that went into these government offices, but he designed everything down to the doorknobs, the chairs, and the heater covers to make the building one complete work of art. To where you couldn't separate the murals from everything else. And this was so popular and such a powerful thing that Mucha ended up becoming the Czech Republic's kind of state artist. He even ended up designing their money. And Art Nouveau, this decorative design, became kind of the de facto identifying art form with the Czech Republic. So Eugenie goes there, she works with him, and Mucha is so impressed by her work that he hires her as one of his assistants. And she and her mother live in a small town outside of Prague for almost over a year. And one of the pieces that she creates is what I'm showing you here, the bust of Alphonse Mucha, showing him, in this very kind of heroic pose, right? He's looking very proud. He's got his sleeves rolled up, so he's shown as a worker, somebody who gets his hands dirty. But also, I can't help but think that for somebody to make a sculpture like this of somebody who was their mentor and who really gave them a chance to develop as an artist in a way that other people wouldn't, that it's done with a lot of love and care that becomes a hallmark of Shonnard as a person and through her work as well. We'll find that she leaves this kind of wake or this legacy of love and a very warm relationships behind her. And in the archives of the New Mexico Museum of Art, we've got letters between her and Mucha that span the rest of his life. He was always supportive of her even after she left the Czech Republic. So I think that's very telling when somebody decides, not only to give you a chance, but to then, support what you do for the rest of your life, really speaks to her prowess as an artist. Now, the piece that she was commissioned to work with him on is this fantastic heroic mural series called the Slav Epic. And it's this series of giant paintings, really huge. Here you can see Mucha working on one of them, and the figure is as large as he is. And it was designed to tell the history of the Czech Republic. So it was this public arts project. So I can't help but think that there is a little bit of looking forward to what's going on in New Deal art, in American government-funded art, in the work that she was doing with Mucha, who became, so much his artwork and the government support of his artwork came to define a national identity for the Czech Republic. And her job was to make paintings of the people in the background, which may seem like kind of an afterthought kind of thing. But when we look at the rest of her work, we see how this could have been a very powerful moment for her, because when she's not working with animals, one of the things that she's doing is creating deep and meaningful representations of local communities that I think would have otherwise been overlooked. We do have heroic portraits of celebrity people like Alphonse Mucha, but more than that, what we get from her are she's interested in making portraits of everyday people in a caring way. So one of the things that makes the Slav Epic so powerful is the way that these background figures really, this one in the center is one that, Mucha would have worked on himself, but everyone in these paintings begins to take on a personality and has a presence, and it shows that the history, of the Slavic people is built on the everyday Slavic people, not only just heroic figures. And I think that this moment really informed the way that she saw, who she wanted to glorify in her work. So another one of her teachers that had a profound impact on her, and this is back in the United States. So keep in mind, this is happening around World War I. We haven't quite gotten to World War II, but she's bouncing back and forth between the United States and Paris and Prague during this time, as many artists were. There was a lot of transatlantic movement happening. So it's not uncommon that she would have gone back and forth between New York and Paris quite a bit. One of her teachers was James Earl Fraser. And James Earl Fraser is perhaps best known for this sculpture, The End of the Trail. And it is a piece that is his reflection on the state of indigenous peoples in the United States around the turn of the century. So this is done around 1915. And we're thinking, this is all happening in the aftermath of Manifest Destiny, right? When the United States has successfully kind of gone from coast to coast and eaten up what a generation before was considered an unimaginably vast amount of land in a surprisingly short amount of time. And when Fraser made this piece, he was thinking of some of the indigenous peoples that he met in Montana and their displacement from their land. And he thought about this as him envisioning, kind of at the end of this colonial project, these indigenous people displaced so far as to be on the coast with nowhere else to go. So it is the literal end of the trail. And you can see the emotion here, right? That this person is completely worn out, the horse itself is completely worn out. It's a very sad image. And I want to loop this back to how this might have informed Shonnard, but I want to talk a little bit about this photograph. And if I was talking to a group of live people, I would ask you, what's one of the first things that you noticed about it? But since you can't answer back, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that what's unusual about this photograph is that we're seeing an atelier, an art school, an art classroom that is of mixed genders this early in this century. We've got women and men working together on the classical figure. Now, remember, one of the things that I said earlier was that a hindrance for women in the arts was they weren't able to get access to the nude models they needed. One of the ways around this was working from plaster models like this. And usually art classrooms were segregated for this reason. But James Earl Fraser's classroom with the Art Students League allowed for this integration and allowed for women to study to become not just designers, but artists with a capital A in their own right, and gave them the resources to do so. So if we keep in mind his End of the Trail, I can't help but think of the way that this conceptualization of indigenous peoples for Shonnard would have shaped the way that she thought about her own work. And one of the things that we don't see as much in her pieces is this generalization of the figure, right? This person has no name. They're a stand-in for all indigenous people across the country, which is an impossibly wide and diverse group of people to distill into just one figure. And it's also incredibly pessimistic, right? James Earl Fraser is pretty much saying, oh gosh, what a shame that there isn't a place for the Native American in contemporary American society, but oh well, this is what happens. Shonnard, on the other hand, working a generation later, this is 10 years later, is creating works where she's depicting indigenous people in a way that is proud. She gives them names, which may not seem like an incredibly big deal, but very much is when we think about the depictions of indigenous folks in the early part of the 20th century, that most of her sculptures of indigenous models, she's not doing them as stereotypes or stand-ins for a race or a general people. She's carving a particular person who has a name and a face and their own particular sense of being. And she's respecting that. And I think that that's very important. And I can't help but think that this was something that she was considering when she was in James Earl Fraser's classroom. Okay. Now we're back across the pond. She gets back to Paris. After working with James Earl Fraser, she goes to Paris and she works with Auguste Rodin, who is, at this time, one of the most important contemporary artists working during that day. So if you can imagine, going from this sick young girl in Yonkers, New York, to working with the best of the best is a meteoric rise. And one of the things that I think is particularly interesting that she picks up from Rodin is the blurring the lines between sculpture and architecture. So this is what you could expect to see of Rodin's work, right? These very modern, you can see the work of his hand. At the time, people complained, that maybe his works weren't as finished or as polished as other sculptors, but that was a bit of his modern design. He was also very mindful of incorporating his work into architecture and making his work reproducible. He, for instance, kind of paved the way in being able to scale down sculpture and recreate them as multiples. And he was very interested in getting them out that way. So if you think about sculpture in the same way that you would think about, say, photography and printmaking, that was a novel idea, but it was something that was important to him. And here I'm showing you again the Keenstone piece from the museum versus his Gates of Hell, which is one of his most ambitious works. And it's a story of Dante. And if you take it apart, you can see individual figures that we all know, right? Here in the middle is the thinker, and everybody knows the thinker, right? And then at the top, the three graces. So he was interested in reusing some of these as individual art pieces. And I believe that it's here that Shonnard is picking up her interest in, or her understanding that just because something is architecture doesn't mean it can't be art too. That her sculpture, just because it's incorporated into a building, doesn't mean that it's limited only to the decorative aspects of that. It can be more. And that's what we're seeing here. And the other thing that I think is interesting, just in terms of conceptualization, is here we've got this almost Spanish colonial religious figure. And when she comes to New Mexico, she's interested in looking at the Spanish colonial tradition and incorporating that into her work. Whereas here, Rodin is giving us the Gates of Hell. So you couldn't really have much more opposite poles in terms of subject matter there. Now we're back to New York, and this is the last hop, back to the United States. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting stories of her work. In 1914, she goes back to New York, and she's approached by the director of the Bronx Zoo. They have just acquired a gorilla named Dinah, who I'm picturing here. And he wants Shonnard to make a bust of Dinah, because Dinah is one of the first gorillas to get to the United States, to get in a public zoo. And at that time, it's a very big deal to have a gorilla. I think it would be kind of akin to having a panda now. Not every zoo has one. I think the panda is the gold standard. Back then, the gorilla was the gold standard. And Shonnard was known for her ability to capture animals in a really striking way. And so she's approached to do this project for the Bronx Zoo, and she does. But something like this has never really been done before. I love gorillas. I think they're great. I would not want to be locked in a room with a gorilla. They can be dangerous. Gorillas are very strong. So here we have her and Dinah, and we have the records where she's talking about what this experience was like for her. And it seemed pretty horrifying that she gets to the Bronx Zoo, she's in this studio, and she just kind of gets locked alone in the room with this gorilla who she does not know, has not met before, and is quite afraid of, as she very well should be, right? I mean, we think of gorillas as very cute, but they are very dangerous animals if they're upset. So she not only has to worry about, how am I going to represent this gorilla artistically? How am I going to do this? How am I going to make this into a really great sculpture? On the one hand, the concerns that any artist would have, but she's also worried about, how am I going to do this without getting attacked by this gorilla? How am I going to get this gorilla to cooperate, right? It's not like a human sitter where you can talk to them and explain, you're here because I'm making a portrait of you. So she spends time with Dinah and comes to realize that as long as she is singing or humming, Dinah is calm. And so she spends the entire session sculpting this, singing and humming to Dinah. And I think this is just another one of those great examples of her loving personality, that she is able to form this emotional connection with Dinah the gorilla, to calm her, to make her comfortable in her presence, and to create a beautiful work of art from them. And this bust is still at the Bronx Zoo. If anybody ever goes, you can see the bust of Dinah the gorilla. But I think it's another great testament to just what a powerful woman she was. Okay, I lied. She does go back to France. And this time she's working in Brittany. And I think that understanding her work for Brittany is important to understanding her work in New Mexico. So Brittany is kind of this more removed area on the west coast of France. It's a lot of fishing villages. It's very, it has a very distinctive visual culture of its own. And she went there for a little bit of peace and solitude. And also to work with the everyday people. So if we think back to the Slav Epic, and we think forward to the kind of portrait she's making in New Mexico, her interest in just the everyday folks who are living in the area, again, becomes prevalent. And here she's showing these busts of just the everyday Brittany peasants, is what they call them. I don't think we would want to use that word today. Peasants is not a very nice word, but that's how she described them. Just, the everyday folks who were living in this village. And she sculpts their busts in this, very beautiful black marble, kind of captures their everyday activities of prayer. We have a series of paintings that she did here, just showing kind of everyday genre scenes of people bringing in the fish or sweeping. And they very much call to mind the work of early Taos artists and their capturing of, everyday life in Taos. And in 1926, she's picked up by a major gallery in Paris, the Galerie Arnauld. Before this, she had been showing in major Parisian salons. She showed in the Salon of 1912, she showed in the Salon of 1913, and the Salon of 1922. And this is important to keep in mind because these are the big leagues of the art world. You really know that you've made it if you're showing internationally in salons, getting your work out there, getting it known, and having this kind of positive critical feedback. So I just say all this again to keep in mind that, even for many people here in New Mexico who might not think of Shonnard as an everyday name, during her time, she was a very serious and very popular artist who gained an enormous amount of success. And this is the piece that I was talking about earlier, the portrait of Chief Ouissa communing with the Great Spirit. I showed you a piece early on of it installed in the gallery to give you a sense of scale. But this was very popular with Europeans, so much so that it was reproduced in this beautiful, again, kind of very Art Nouveau style. So we're looking back again to echoes of her time with folks like Mucha. This beautiful print that was used to promote her exhibition that we have several copies of in the museum archive. So we're very lucky to have this kind of material still here in New Mexico. And it was all gifted to us by Shonnard herself. Now, we finally arrive in New Mexico, 1926. She's invited to Santa Fe by the Museum of New Mexico founder, Edgar Lee Hewitt. And Edgar Lee Hewitt was originally an archaeologist. He was known for his work in the Southwest and in Mexico. He is perhaps best remembered as founding the State of New Mexico Museum System and the School for Advanced Research. So all of the state museums that we have here in Santa Fe and throughout New Mexico, we have him to thank for that. And one of the programs that he initiated was opening up the museum itself to provide studios for artists. So I think we're very kind of conditioned now to look back at these historic artists and think of them as historic, as from the past. But it's important to keep in mind that when they were working, when this was all happening, they were the most cutting edge, the most contemporary. And that our museum systems here were made to engage with contemporary art, that the people of New Mexico and people that were coming to New Mexico, the work that they were seeing was world class, that the artists that they were engaging with here were people like Shonnard who had built careers in places like New York and Paris and were the big names of their day. That didn't start with O'Keeffe, that had been the story the whole time. So Hewitt was giving her the space and the resources to come and live and work here and be an artist. And, that was the case for a lot of folks. Marston Hartley, Gustav Baumann, they all got their start because they were given studio space in the museum. Early it was the History Museum, later it was the Museum of Art. And the other thing that I wanted to mention about Hewitt that is important is, we've talked a lot about how Shonnard was able to build this career as a female artist in the early part of the 20th century. And Hewitt, love him or hate him, he's a bit of a controversial figure. I know he was a bit of a bully during his day. They called him El Toro because he was just a bull. But one of the things that he was known for was giving women chances that other people would not. As an archaeologist, we have written responses from many of his students and many of the women who went on archaeological digs with him, who would, on the one hand, complain of what maybe a difficult person he was to be around sometimes, but on the other hand say, he was the one who would let women come out and actually work on archaeological digs, which was something that a lot of other archaeologists wouldn't do. And the same case went for the artists, right? That he did fund. Louis Crowe, who did this portrait, was one of them, who worked in Paris. Shonnard is another one, that he gave women artists the opportunity that a lot of other people wouldn't at that time. In 1927, she was offered an exhibition at the New Mexico Museum of Art. And here's an example of some of the work that she presented in those shows. And these are all in the collection of the Art Museum now. And these are large busts of Pueblo figures for the most part on the left, and then other other sitters on the right. But she was known to be very close with folks, particularly from San Ildefonso Pueblo. She became very good friends with Maria Martinez, so much so that Maria Martinez was in her house when she was giving birth to her first son. So they did have, again, it's just another example of her building these relationships with people and becoming very close with them. And now I know that we're running low on time, so I want to wrap up a bit and tell you all about Keenstone. So I've brought up this image a few times as an example of the kind of artwork that she would make that was designed to be incorporated into architecture. And this certainly would have. But she was a very adventurous woman, not only in terms of her training, right, and her willingness to kind of travel around the world to work with the best, but she wanted to push the boundaries of the materials she was working with too. And she actually went to the extent of inventing her own new material called Keenstone, which is the best I can describe it is kind of a very light concrete. But she wanted something that she could work with that would be malleable, that would be easy to carve into, but would be a lot lighter than other forms of concrete or stone that would get worked into architectural settings. And so this is an example of that. That we have now. It's deceptively light. It looks like a giant piece of maybe sandstone, but you can pick it up and we were able to actually hang it on the wall. So this was a great breakthrough for her. But we've learned a lot in the past few years from that archaeological excavation at the Shonnard house about the road that she took to get here. Because she was one who would want to make all of her materials herself. So she didn't only make the Keenstone, she wanted to make the individual elements that went into the Keenstone too. And one of those is lime. And we have a great example when they were doing the archaeological excavation at her house. They found if you can imagine, a melted kiln. So she was working on kind of creating some of the material to mix into the Keenstone. And at some point it got so hot that it exploded and melted her kiln. So if you can just imagine the kind of, adventurousness that would take to be exploding kilns in downtown Santa Fe in the 1920s, I think is very interesting. And so I will leave us here so we can have time to talk a bit more about the fountain itself. But if there are any questions, please put them in the comments and I'm happy to answer them. But I hope that I've given you all a nice kind of survey and background for Shonnard, so we have kind of a better understanding of who she was and why she's so important and why this fountain is even more important now to save and to preserve the legacy of this great artist.
You're unmuted, thank you. You're unmuted, thank you.
We want to thank you very much for providing us this wonderful history on her, who was obviously a really strong individual to take off as much as she did in her time as a strong woman. And we're glad she kind of ended up here and really loved New Mexico. Thank you very much.
We're lucky she landed here.
Yeah, really. Well, I appreciate you sharing about the fountain because, of course, that is a focus of our organization right now is the restoration of that fountain. It is, as he said, in Truth or Consequences. And it was built originally in 1937 in the town of Hot Springs because it had hot springs, and that's another whole story, but that it was the only kind of treatment that was available back then for polio. And our president, Franklin Roosevelt, had polio and was treated at Warm Springs, Georgia, with the hot springs that was provided there. So we had polio hit this state, and many, many children were attacked with it. And so I think both Clyde Tingley, our governor at the time, and his wife, who had no children, loved children, and wanted to do things for our children. And at some point or other, they decided we should definitely need to have a hospital that could take care of our children with polio. And so Hot Springs, New Mexico was chosen as the location. And I just love to share the story that It was given to me by Bill Lumpkins, an architect of the New Deal and artist. And the firm that he worked in was here in New Mexico. And one day after they had gotten the opportunity to be the architects to build a hospital down in Truth or Consequences, Mrs. Tingley came to call at their architectural firm and said, I'd like to find out more how my poliomyelitis hospital's coming along. And Bill said, we all kind of looked down at the ground and went, finally one said, I'm sorry, Mrs. Tingley, but we really don't know what a poliomyelitis hospital has to have in it. She said, well, that's not a problem. Where's your phone? And so they took her into an office and she dialed a number, and this woman on the other hand said, hello? And Carrie said, Eleanor, is that you? We need to talk about something. We've got a polio hospital we want to build down here, but they don't know what to do with it. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, well, that's not a problem. I know the guy who built the Warm Springs, Georgia hospital for my husband to get treated at. And 2 weeks later, thanks to those two women, that man came to Albuquerque and brought the plans to build this facility. And it was built in 1937 to take care of those children. And we'd love to know where some of those children are today and how they are. But our organization, the National New Deal Preservation Group, got started in 1998. And since then, we've had various chapters in addition, and New Mexico, though, has been the strongest one and is still doing a lot. So far, since 1998, we've spent $600,000 on 148 different public art pieces of the New Deal, either restoring, conserving, or preserving. And this was in like 21 towns all over the state. And there's more to do. But this year, we're putting our efforts into restoring the fountain at the old Carrie Tingley Hospital, and this is what she did, and this is what it looked like when she got through with it. And those children loved that fountain, and they loved to get, when they could get a chance to get in the pond, or just to run their hands through the pond, or to get in there and play with the animals. And today, that hospital facility is still there after 1937, and it is still serving our people. The people it is serving is the veterans of New Mexico who need to be in a nursing home. And this is in the courtyard of the full building, and it doesn't look like this anymore. And the 80-some veterans that are there still have the opportunity to go out and see it, but they can't see the water squirting because all of the plumbing within the animals is totally mineralized. So there's a big job ahead for the plumbing of these turtles. And at some point or other, that it quit doing its squirting, the maintenance crew put in this hose to try to give it some more water, and in the process they caused the thing to get squirted on the animals, particularly the turtles. And they are made of the Keenstone that he was speaking of. And then they painted them white, and with the water hitting and the age, they look terrible now. You could tell the ducks didn't get much damage to them. But look, the tower that he mentioned that had the frogs at the top is no longer there. It exists. It's in a warehouse, and it could be restored again. And that's what we hope, to put all of this together and make it a beautiful place and a beautiful fountain that can provide peace and a place for people, the veterans, to bring their families and go sit outside and visit and talk and be outside instead of in their in their bedrooms at the facility. But it is a big project, and we are happy that many people have already donated money to it, but there's more, of course, needed. So if anyone is interested in finding out more about it, you could contact us, the New Mexico chapter of the National New Deal Preservation Association. And we have a website that is up on your screen now, NNDPA
It's not com, it's org.
It's org.
That's incorrect on the screen.
That says org.
That's
It says
org.
com.
But it,
Oh.
a lot is trying to help here. But anyway,
Yeah.
is it org or com?
No, it is
It is org.
.org. I was
Okay.
reading the email.
All right, that is a new website that we have put up, and we're pleased with it. We're excited about it. And here our telephone number and our box. Our telephone number,
Chopped off. Sorry.
the box number is wrong. I'm sorry. The box number is 602 if you would like to send donations there. Or you can call and talk to me at 505-690-5845, and our email address in blue there is newdeal@cybermesa.com. And we would love to share with you all the things that we've learned about it. And if you know of people who you would like to, say, make a donation on their behalf as a memorial to their life for giving to their service in this country, we would love to have that, because this is what we're trying to do. We want to thank our veterans today, and they're currently down there 80 veterans. Of that group, 16 are women. Half of them were veterans themselves, and the other half are wives of veterans. The facility is being looked at now also by our legislature in terms of trying to meet the needs of the building itself. And so it's a big item, and we hope you will jump in and say, hey, I want to help you by preserving, well, in this case, this is a restoration project for sure. And we want that tower to be put back on, and those frogs get to squirt. It's a beautiful piece, it was a beautiful piece of art. But the beauty that it has given, the specialness that it gave to the children and now to the veterans, is very, very special. And I suspect that you might know someone you would like to memorialize and help us with that coming about as a very beautiful project that would thrill many, many people. And of course, the community is proud of it, but we are proud of it, and we are proud to be part of the restoration of it, as we have been with all of the other things that we have done across the state. We've had conservators that we've paid to do things like take 6 coats of paint off of murals and get us back to the original. So we have found some fabulous artwork that had been covered up, and it's been a wonderful trip for the National New Deal Preservation Association and its New Mexico chapter. And we hope that you will join us in your desire to be a part of this, and to bring back Shonnard's very, very special talent. There's another piece I just thought of it at the university in Socorro, New Mexico Tech. Another female fountain. No, it's not a fountain, but it's in the center of the campus, and also has little animals around the edging of it. So that love of animals she carried throughout her life.
There's
and
a
we're fortunate.
There's a question in the chat that I think refers to what you just described, which is, are there any other public works like the Turtle Fountain? And you described there was one in another location. Christian, are you aware of any others?
The easy answer to that is yes and no. Unfortunately, a lot of her works have been disassembled at this point. One of the reasons for that is that the Keenstone material that we're talking about, because it was so experimental, and kind of there was nothing quite like it at the time. If it's been exposed too much to nature, or say, for instance, somebody has redirected a bunch of water onto it, it's going to dissolve pretty quickly. So a lot of her public work has kind of been put into private, and it's still public, put into the museum's hands. But I can say this, she was a very religious woman, and she was excited to work on chapels. And there are several chapels here in Santa Fe that you can visit and see some of that work in the downtown area. And that's why I say yes and no, because these chapels are both public and private, depending on the level of access that they're comfortable with. And I'm not sure if you're able to get into them now, but a lot of that work was for private chapels that are in the plaza area that are usually available, but I don't know if they are right now. I'm sorry, that's not a great answer, but.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it, because I knew that she had done work in chapels also, yes. Yes.
I think one of the important things is that many of these chapels are in Santa Fe. And, I love Santa Fe. I am always a big cheerer for Santa Fe, but it's really important for us to also focus on artwork that are in other parts of the state, like TRC, and making sure that those are, restored so that people in other places don't always have to just come to downtown Santa Fe to see all the great work that New Mexico has to offer. So we've got to get this fountain ready so people can get a little bit of diversity in terms of geography here.
I think that taking us back to Santa Fe, because we are very proud of the one down in TRC, but I think it's very interesting that in the past few years, there has now become a fountain, similar fountain, not, I think because it has some ducks on it, on the side in her yard of her building, which is now the foundation,
of course,
as you mentioned. And the ducks, as I recall, goodness, I can't remember if they're ducks or turtles, but
they were ducks.
One here?
Yes.
Okay, so those came from a private source, and they have made some more, and so that little fountain is not anything like the one it's not as big as the one she did, but there's some similarity. Pardon?
It'll give you a taste.
Yes.
It'll give you a taste of the fountain. So yeah, of course, at the Shonnard House. So that's on Paseo de Peralta. It's now the offices of the New Mexico Museum Foundation, but anybody can go, and you can just drive up, park there. There's a really beautiful, gorgeous, beautifully landscaped outdoor area where this fountain is, and it's just a wonderful place to visit, especially right now in the spring. So that's a great some public works you can see to get a little idea of what the fountain would be like.
Where on Paseo?
Where is that exactly?
It's about a block west of the Capitol. As you turn off of Cerrillos and turn on to Paseo de Peralta, it comes up on your right, maybe the first block or the second block, but it looks the same building. It's there.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you can just pull into the parking lot and walk up to the garden, which is great because parking in downtown Santa Fe is not great. So if you can just park and walk, that's real good.
But if you go look at them, remember the turtles that are down in TRC that need your help. And
there they are.
This is what we want to take it back to. And think of that as what a wonderful meeting place it is when families come to see their veterans. They can roll their wheelchairs out there or come out with their walkers and sit on the bases and visit. And if we can get the plumbing working again, can enjoy that peaceful sound of water and make them feel so much happier with their lives in that facility. So we want to make that happen, and we hope you will help us.
Well, I think that concludes our first virtual fireside chat, and we're hoping to plan some more, but we really got it off to a great start. Thank you again,
yes,
Christian. It was
thank you.
phenomenal. I learned so much from that.
My pleasure.
Really
Thank you for having me.
Another chat comment there, question.
Is the state doing any matching restoration project? There's talk about restoring and renovating the facility, but not the fountain. The fountain itself is pretty much our purview.
But we are talking. And in fact, the Legislative Finance Committee people were at TRC, at the fountain, in the building this week. So they have all gotten a chance to see it. And I hope they come back and say, we really got to do something about this.
Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll get back to you with our next virtual fireside chat. You can follow us on our Facebook page and our New Mexico New Deal chapter. We gave you the email address for that. So I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was so enjoyable.
Yay.
Do you close it from there?
You can end it right here.
Okay.